Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for our training on lead-based paint policies and procedures. My name is Byla Lindener. I am joined today by my colleague, Nicole Thomas, and we are from Home Base. Home Base, for those of you who don't know, is a nonprofit organization. We provide technical assistance and training to the Santa Clara County Office of Supportive Housing, and also housing and homeless service providers in the county as well. I am also very pleased to say that we are joined today by two excellent guest presenters, Tui and Nadia from the Housing Authority. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I just wanted to quickly run through some tech information about the training. So you are all muted. You were all muted when you entered the room, so to speak. And we ask that you stay muted unless we ask you to unmute yourself, just to cut down on background noise. Also, just please note that we are recording this training and are going to make this recording available on the COC website, but the chat box will not be recorded. If you have questions during the training, please feel free to let us know in the chat box. Or if you also are having any kind of technical difficulties, also feel free to let us know in the chat box as well. We will be monitoring that throughout the training just to make sure that we're addressing any questions as they arise. We may also pause periodically to address questions as well. We also do have closed captioning available. There should be a button at the bottom that says live transcript. And once you click on that, there should be a button that says show subtitles. So feel free to set that up for yourselves as well. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you. I think most of us are probably familiar with the chat box, but just to make sure, can we have also just to familiarize ourselves and introduce ourselves, can we have everyone maybe go into the chat box and introduce yourself, or maybe share a food you're an expert on? I'm seeing an enthusiastic hello. Wonderful. I also just want to note we're going to be launching a few polls throughout, and those are just going to be quick comprehension checks. Oh, love sushi. I never got on the sushi train, but I know quite a few people are fans. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So please just continue introducing yourself in the chat. We want to make this as engaging as possible given the topic. So I'm going to go over the agenda for today. So we're going to start off with, I'll be covering sources of lead and the impact of exposure. We're then going to cover key steps in HUD lead regulatory compliance, and Tui from the Housing Authority will be covering that. And that's going to cover necessary documentation, notifications, and designated parties for each step, along with being really clear what the timeline for those steps are. We're then going to cover elevated blood lead level interventions. And finally, along with coordination with the Public Health Department for that, and then close off with some resources, including the Office of Supportive Housing's lead-based paint policy. So I want to start saying that the primary objective of this training is not to convince you that lead-based paint is the most exciting topic in the world, but really to underscore the importance of identifying lead-based paint and why it's such a serious public health hazard, and hopefully to demystify the notification and control steps that should be taken if a hazard is identified in a way that makes it feel clear, manageable, and actionable for all of you. So lead is a naturally occurring element throughout the environment. Additionally, in the United States, vaporized lead was used in gasoline for over 80 years. So there's lead all over, on the streets, on the walls of our houses, and in the dirt. In houses, lead was added to paint to add durability and spreadability in residences built prior to 1978. And it's been used in the solder of lead and copper pipes that can leach into water unless that water is properly treated. Lead can also be found in the covering of ceramic tiles and pots. But lead dust from deteriorated paint is the most common source of lead poisoning for young children. And we really need to keep children away from crawling anywhere there's lead dust or lead in the soil, as it's a major hazard to have them touch this and then put their hands in their mouths as a result. So childhood lead poisoning is a major environmental health problem in the United States, especially for low-income families and poor living conditions, if not detected early. Children with high levels of lead in their bodies can suffer from damage to the brain and nervous system, have behavioral and learning problems, slowed growth, hearing problems, and more. It's dangerous particularly for children, although workers can also be affected if they're exposed to high levels of lead. And lead is stored in the body because our bodies actually confuse it with other minerals like calcium, but it can begin to cause serious health problems affecting the bones and kidneys. And women can actually store lead in their bones and have it leach back into their blood at a later point, and it can affect unborn fetuses as well. So I hope this underscores how big of a health concern this is. And as we know, as the pandemic has persisted, with multiple shelter-in-place orders and being stuck at home, there's larger potential exposure to lead dust. And actually, with increasing home DIY projects during this time at home, there's an added potential exposure as surfaces are being disrupted. So lead-based paint exposure and poisoning is a public health concern once again, but it's something that we have the power to prevent. And the Santa Clara housing provider community has a long-standing commitment and duty to place families in safe housing. And in addition, we know that lead-based paint policies have been an area of focus in recent HUD monitoring, and we expect this to continue to be a focus in monitoring. So it's important that agencies have robust policies and procedures in place that are HUD compliant. So COC and ESG funded program staff grantees are responsible for ensuring that property owners and managers meet the lead-based paint requirements and comply with the Lead-Based Paint Poisoning Prevention Act of 1973, the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act, and the Lead Safe Housing Rule, Part 35, and those are the listed subparts. Before we go any further, there's going to be a lot of terms that you might not have heard before. And so we're just going to quickly go over a glossary of some of the terms, and they'll make a lot more sense once they're put in context. But I'll just preview some of them. So I'm going to go over a visual assessment, which is an inspection to identify deteriorated paint chips and other debris to determine if previous hazard controls are intact. De minimis levels are a threshold that will determine how to proceed with paint stabilization. And if it exceeds de minimis levels, the owner should then use workers that are trained in lead-safe work practices, which are a group of techniques that reduce the amount of dust produced by renovation activities. Clearance is an inspection that combines visual and quantitative environmental evaluation procedures to determine that no lead-based paint hazards remain. An index unit is a housing unit where a child with an elevated blood level resides, whereas a covered unit refers to federally assisted housing units in the property where a child under 6 lives or is expected to live. A risk assessment is an inspection that uses chemical testing and X-ray fluorescent technology to identify lead-based paint. And the environmental investigation is basically a risk assessment plus additional interviews and testing to determine other factors that may have contributed to a child's elevated blood level. I just want to reiterate, this was a slew of perhaps new terms. I I hope and promise they're going to make more sense as we go through. And I'm seeing some additional people are in the waiting room, so I'm just going to quickly admit them. So hopefully now we've kind of covered why potential lead-based paint hazards should be on our radar. And the very first step in this process is disclosure. So lead-based paint disclosures must be provided to all households and housing units built prior to 1978. And owners or property managers are required to provide tenants with both a disclosure form that discloses presence of known and unknown paint, and a copy of Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home, a pamphlet. This pamphlet should be provided at the time of move-in or lease up before any contract is signed. And the owner needs to keep administrative records that both the owner delivered it and the tenant received it. So as I said, signed forms should be kept on file by owners, grantees, and tenants, and you really want to make sure it is the proper form. And you want to make sure you have this correct form signed and on file, as it's a federal violation if you don't, which can result in hefty fines. So we want to prevent that. And at the end of the slide deck, we're going to provide links just to make sure that you're connected to the right disclosure forms. Now, while the property owner and manager is responsible for this step, sharing this information with your clients and ensuring they've received it is an easy thing to do, and it makes your job far easier in the long run. Informed tenants are more likely to watch for potential problems in their homes and then proactively work with landlords to address any issues. So the second step in this process is determining whether a visual assessment is required. Program staff can determine this by asking two questions. One, was the leased property constructed before 1978? And the second question is a child under the age of 6 expected to live in the unit? If the answer is no to either of these questions or both, a visual assessment is not required. To determine the age of a unit, staff can use formal public records that are available online. These can include tax assessment records, and you'll want to print out a copy of the screenshot for the case file, just to verify the age of the unit. And there are a few exceptions for when a visual assessment is not required. So if a client has a Section 8 voucher and is receiving, let's say, ESG assistance for a security deposit or arrears, ESG staff are then required to obtain the documentation that a visual assessment was conducted from the agency that administered that other form of assistance, but staff wouldn't be expected to conduct a visual assessment of their own, so long as you're keeping records that the visual assessment has been conducted in the case file. Now, lead-based paint was banned for commercial use in 1978, but in the case of jurisdictions that ban the sale or residential use of lead-containing paint prior to 1978, HUD may designate an earlier date, and that unit may be exempt from the lead-safe housing rule. You'll often see 0-bedroom or SRO units on the list of exemptions, but I really want to highlight that if a child under the age of 6 is expected to reside in a 0-bedroom or SRO unit, it is not exempt. Finally, if it's documented that a unit has had lead-based paint completely removed by HUD standards, then no visual inspection would need to be done, but you want to make sure that you're including a copy of whatever documentation it is that you have that the lead was removed, and keep that in file. And as a best practice, you really should provide the lead safety form to the tenant and let the tenant know that the unit has had all the lead be removed. So you want to make sure as program staff that you're documenting any exemptions in case files. And we're going to go ahead and launch a first just quick poll, a quick comprehension check, and I'm also going to check the chat as we do that. I think I am seeing message that I'm joining. Is that still the case? Or I know there are a couple of people in the waiting room, but I believe I've admitted everyone. Please do let us know through the chat if there's still some difficulties, because we want to make sure everyone who wants to attend is able to. Okay, wonderful. I think I hear that that's been resolved. Okay, we're going to end the poll now. And I'm seeing most people said yes, lead-based paint disclosures must be provided to households in housing units built prior to 1978, even if it's not expected that a child under the age of 6 is going to reside there. And that is in fact correct. So a common misconception is if there isn't a child, none of this needs to happen. There are additional steps that we're going to go over that won't pertain to old housing units because there's no child, but that first disclosure step is necessary regardless. So that's great. Also, for other questions, I just want to note we're definitely going to make time at the end to answer all questions. So please feel free to keep coming in the chat, but we'll spend some time at the end to address those. So program staff will determine whether lead-based paint requirements are triggered by asking the 2 questions that I mentioned in the slide before and checking exemptions. And then because assistance cannot be provided until the visual assessment has been completed and the unit's been cleared, it's important for program staff to schedule a visual assessment as quickly as possible and then conduct the visual assessment. So visual assessments must be conducted regardless of whether the program participant is receiving assistance to remain in an existing unit or moving to a new unit. A visual assessment must be conducted prior to providing financial assistance and on an annual basis thereafter for as long as assistance is provided or at unit turnover. A visual assessment looks for deteriorated paint chips, dust, debris, and determines whether previous hazard control measures are still intact. And the good news is that anyone can become a HUD certified visual assessor. You need to successfully complete a 20-minute free online training on HUD's website and then have evidence that staff have successfully completed that training and keep that on file for review during site visits, and have the dates of assessment dates of assessment for all visual assessments along with findings should be kept on record. Now, the information provided in the following slides are just a teaser and a brief overview of content that's going to be covered in HUD Certified Visual Assessor free online training. We want to note that the online course does not qualify you to perform clearance sampling or risk assessments. Those are 2 different types of assessments that require quantitative chemical testing, whereas a visual assessment, as the name would suggest, is more of a observatory test, which is just purely qualitative and it doesn't have a chemical testing or lab component. I also do want to note that there are no lead-based paint waivers at the moment, but if you're conducting a visual assessment via video call and your program, along with doing the visual assessment and HQS, should have program policies and procedures that state how you'll be conducting a visual assessment virtually, and those instructions should be in your case file. That is the case. So the first step with a visual assessment is to check if paint is peeling, chipping, chalking, or cracking. And if the answer is yes to any of these, then paint should be considered deteriorated. When you're conducting a visual assessment, you want to identify deteriorated paint, and you'll also want to know what is causing that deteriorated paint. So here we see an example of peeling, which is often caused by moisture or poor surface preparation. This is an example of chipping, which is often caused by poor surface preparation, but also by impact to surface area. So we often see chipping where there's friction and two surfaces are meeting and rubbing up against each other. This is an example of chalking. If paint contains lead, then the chalk will also contain lead. And some paint was actually designed to chalk as a means of keeping paint surfaces clean. But with chalking, you want to look for chalking on the surfaces, but also below and on the ground. And hopefully, I'm not sure how visible it is in this photo, but when you think chalking, you can literally think of a blackboard and that kind of chalky residue. That's what you're looking for on these paint surfaces. With cracking, you might see settlement cracks in older homes. And when performing a visual assessment, you're not going to be asked to identify tack or nail holes because smaller hairline cracks or other surface imperfections are stable or most likely stable and they won't have caused damage. But if the size is larger than a nail hole or a hairline crack, you should consider the paint to be deteriorated. A substrate is the foundation in which something sits on. So here it would be what the stair is, the base or foundation of that. So with damaged substrates, this can include dry rot, rust, a component not being securely fastened, crumbling plaster, missing siding, and there can also be moisture damage. So on this slide, we're seeing that the stair tread shows wear and tear and deterioration, and we see the child crawling up on it, which is a hazard if the child then puts their hands in their mouths and swallows some of the dust. So as I said, when conducting a visual assessment, you don't just want to note the deteriorated paint, you want to look for the source of what's causing the issue as best as you can. So here we see moisture damage. And with paint stabilization measures, you would one, look for the source of the moisture and fix the cause, then repair the surface, and then repaint. So when inspecting surfaces, as I said, imperfections larger than nail holes or hairline cracks should be considered deteriorated. De minimis levels set a size threshold for how repairs must be made, but not if repairs must be made. So I really want to stress how. If more than 10% of the total surface area of an interior or exterior component with a small surface area is deteriorated, then the de minimis level has been exceeded. So once again, please note that these levels control the how, not whether a repair is made. If deteriorated paint is identified, it must be repaired, regardless of if it meets the threshold or not. So for any one interior room, the de minimis level is a total of 2 square feet. And if de minimis levels are exceeded, then safe work practices and a clearance must be performed. And as you may recall from the glossary slides, lead safe work practices are those group of techniques that reduce the amount of dust that's being produced by the renovation activities. So with interior de minimis levels, you're looking at the floors, the walls, and the ceilings in the room. For exterior surfaces, the de minimis level is 20 square feet, and this is a total of 20 square feet on all exterior surfaces. So this includes outbuildings, fences, and equipment that is attached to the ground. And once again, if the de minimis level is exceeded, safe work practices and a clearance must be performed. And in this photo, you see kind of a rough visualization of what 20 square feet would be. So as a recap, it's no more than 10% of a total surface area of an interior or exterior component with a small surface area. So here you want to think trim, baseboard, things that have a small surface area. It's no more than 2 square feet for any one interior room and no more than 20 square feet for a total of exterior surfaces. Can we launch a second poll now, actually? The visual assessments must be, okay, I'm seeing a question. So as people respond to this, I'm just gonna quickly go back. So as the slide notes, with the question regarding visual assessments, the visual assessment needs to be provided on an annual basis. So I hope that answers that question. So it's not no matter how long ago, but the visual inspection would have to happen annually. Unless the question was specifically regarding a unit in which there was a visual assessment. The only case where the visual assessment wouldn't have to be done on this annual basis is if it's been reported that the lead has been fully removed from the unit according to HUD's regulations. And in that instance, you have to have that documentation be kept on file. But we can return to this in a little more detail at the end when if there are any other questions. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds for a few more people to maybe answer the poll, and then we'll share results out. Okay. So the question or the statement was, if the deteriorated paint area does not exceed de minimis levels, the area does not need to be repaired. And most people said this is false, and they are right in saying this is false. Because as I noted, regardless of whether it exceeds or does not exceed de minimis levels, the area needs to be repaired. The only thing the de minimis levels help dictate is how it should be repaired. Because if it exceeds de minimis levels, then those safe work practices will be triggered, but it needs to be repaired regardless. So I hope that's clear. Now we're going to do a little bit of practice actually on de minimis rates and de minimis levels. And so the practice hypothetical is that you're in an interior room that is 50 linear feet and it has a baseboard that's 6 inches high. So the deteriorated area in this interior room is 6 by 12 inches. And I want to know if this exceeds the de minimis rate. Now, the tricky part with this is you want to make sure your units are consistent. In this hypothetical, we're seeing some measurements be in feet and some measurements be in inches. So the first step would be to convert everything to feet. And then we want to compare the deteriorated area to the 2 square foot interior de minimis level and the 10% threshold for components that have a small surface area, because a baseboard has a small surface area. Okay, I'm just seeing something. Paint, okay. I just want to note that I am seeing questions in the chat. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to respond to these questions at the end. But thank you. I will take note of them. So first, we're going to calculate the total area. So we know that was 50 linear feet by 6 inches. We're going to convert the 6 inches to half a foot. That's 25 square feet. We then want to calculate the 10% de minimis threshold. So 10%, that's 0.1. We multiply that by the 25 square feet, which was the total area. That gives us 2.5 square feet. Then want to calculate the deteriorated area, which we know was 6 inches by 12 inches. So 6 inches is half a foot, 12 inches is 1 foot. That gives us half a square foot. And now we're going to ask, does this exceed the de minimis rate? And the answer would be no. This room does not exceed the de minimis rate because the deteriorated area is half a square foot, which is less than 2 square feet and less than the 10% de minimis threshold for small surface areas. I hope that hypothetical made the calculation seem less scary as opposed to overwhelming. And things to look out for with visual assessments. So you want to look for deteriorated paint on all building components and pay special notice to walls, windows, or trim that's damaged from a roof or plumbing leak. You want to look at surfaces that might have experienced friction or impact. As we know, two surfaces sliding or striking against each other can cause paint to deteriorate. You want to look for paint chips and dust left over from painting activities that weren't properly cleaned up, and paint chips and soil near drip lines or exterior surfaces. And if you see any evidence of paint chips or debris that were not cleaned up, you want to ask the owner to clean it up, and this should include misted sweeping and damp mopping. Now, really quickly, just imagine you're conducting a visual assessment right now. Is anyone feeling brave enough to maybe come off mute and identify what the first picture is an indication of? Or if no one's feeling particularly up for unmuting themselves, chat is another option. If we could identify yes.
Seems like chip paint, chipping.
That's correct. Thank you. It is chipping. Does anyone want to go for what the second one might be? Maybe I can pull up the. Oh, if I went back to the slides, it'd be a little too obvious. But does anyone remember what this might be? If not the actual name of it, what's concerning about the second photo?
Is it that it's a high friction area?
Well, yeah, substrates are, because they're the foundation of something, they do often have that kind of impact. And here we're seeing some wear and tear. In the case of the stairs, we know this might be a potential section that children might be climbing up on. So really making sure you're looking at that deteriorated area to note for substrate rot, moisture damage, anything that would cause it's rubbed off friction, right? Okay, I'm seeing chalking as one of the options, and the picture might be a little misleading into, I can see how it might look that way, but I was really trying to use this photo as an example of damaged substrates. Thank you so much for all of the participation. Can we maybe move on to the last picture with that bubbling? What kind of getting into, not only are you looking for deteriorated paint, you're also looking for sources. What is causing?
Is that moisture deterioration?
Yes, yes. With the bubbling, we are definitely seeing moisture damage. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. So we have determined, so this slide, this is I'm going to amend the slide when I send it back out. It says ESG staff, but it's also COC. It's all program staff's responsibilities to determine whether lead-based paint requirements are triggered. As we mentioned, there are those questions that you would ask. You would then inform clients and property owners of the paint requirements, schedule that visual assessment. You conduct the visual assessment with the steps we just went over, identify those risks, compare it to the de minimis levels, and then you make an assistance determination. Staff should document the level of identified problems with paint surfaces. If the area of paint to be stabilized exceeds the de minimis levels, again, we're using lead safe work practices and a clearance would be required. If deteriorating paint doesn't exceed this level, then safe work practices and clearance isn't required, but all deteriorated paint identified must be repaired before the unit is approved for assistance. And if deteriorated paint is not identified, that's great. The unit can be cleared for assistance. So now we're going to go on to paint stabilization. It's the owner's role to conduct paint stabilization on any deteriorated paint and to engage a certified lead professional to conduct a clearance examination when work is complete, and then send a notice of lead hazard reduction. Again, here, this is all program staff, COC or ESG program staff, should then confirm all identified deteriorated paint has been stabilized. Now with paint stabilization, they're again going to identify the cause of damage and fix the cause, and then prepare the surface to receive new paint. The owner should incorporate occupant protection and relocation if necessary, and document relocation exemptions. I want to note that a clearance exam combines the visual assessment, but it has chemical testing as well. The clearance inspection cannot be conducted by the same firm that is repairing the deteriorated paint. It is the property owner or manager's responsibility to obtain clearance, and program staff can pay for in this case, ESG program staff can pay for the first clearance inspection and use funds under the financial assistance category. But if the unit does not pass initial clearance inspection, those funds may not be used to pay for additional inspections. And failure by the property owner to fulfill responsibilities on their own or with the assistance of the program prohibits programs from assisting a tenant in that unit. When a clearance exam is not required because the area has not exceeded de minimis levels, program staff should confirm that the identified deteriorated paint has been repaired, and again, document that in case files. With ongoing responsibilities, the owner should incorporate ongoing lead-based paint maintenance activities into regular building operations and conduct ongoing lead-based paint monitoring. And staff, again, need to conduct a visual assessment of the stability of painted surfaces on an annual basis during the assistance period or at unit turnover. As I mentioned, ongoing maintenance is not required if the lead-based paint was completely removed. But in this instance, staff should make sure they're including a copy of whatever documentation they have that the lead was removed in the file. And as a best practice, provide, again, the lead safety form to the tenant and let the tenant know that the unit has had all lead removed. Now I'm going to hand it over to Tui from the Housing Authority, and they're going to go over, or she's going to go over lead-based paint compliance, really talk through who's the designated party for each step, along with the timeline. Some of this is going to overlap with sections that I've covered, but we recognize lead-based paint policies and procedures, they have many steps, the timeline, certain things are happening simultaneously. It can be a little confusing, and we think in some cases it's worth bearing kind of some repetition just to make it really clear. So I'm going to hand it over to Tui now.
Thank you, Nico. I have my colleague with me, Nadia, who will chime in if I have any technical difficulties through Zoom. So I apologize for that. But before we dive into a compliance overview for grantees, just give you some pointers. I will be talking it from a point of view of a housing authority's role in administrating our housing choice voucher program, but then the expectation is you're taking that role as your grantee. So if you are administering TIBA, homes, COC, this is what you are required to do in regarding compliance, okay? In addition, keep in mind there's roles here that owners are responsible for, but we as administrator of a program that's federally funded must educate our owners. So it's not just having an owner sign a document. This might be something brand new to them, a lot of technical issues that need to be done, outsourcing to a certified person to clean up or so on. So we must also educate our owners to ensure that they're complying and serving our family well, because ultimately this is and could be a life-threatening situation when it comes to lead-based paint, okay? So I'm actually on the phone training, but Nicole is going to be helping me with the agenda item. So we just talked about what I'm going to go over, just some key points overview. I will be sharing a lot of resources you can go to get checklists, to get references to a regulation, videos, documentation, what kind of notifications we need to give. Record keeping also will be coming down the line, and Nicole will cover that more in detail later. And then designating who is going to be responsible for what process. So again, it does highlight housing choice vouchers, but just remember, if you're an administrator of a federally funded program, you are required to take these steps. If it's an owner's responsibility, you are also required to educate them in their responsibility. If we continue to pay owners on these units and the units are unsafe, we as administrator of the program are held liable for those. And also we can also be held liable for the family down the line if there's any lawsuits, so please keep that in mind. So an owner's responsibility is if they're notified, initial notification of a confirmed case. So if an owner, a lot of notifications of exposure comes in different ways. It could be directly from the owner, from our inspectors, from our staff. So we're going to try to cover as much point as we can in this scenario, and it is always going to be different throughout. So initial notifications of a confirmed case needs to be sent to the HUD field office. If you are not familiar who administers your program in the HUD field office, please make sure you speak to your staff and get that in contact information. In addition, you must also notify the HUD Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. I do have an email address for them down the slides, so you'll be able to get that information. This notification must be done within 5 business days. It must also include the children's address, and we'll talk more about other information. Initial notification, of the Public Health Department when necessary. So our housing authority has been working, trying to get a partnership collaboration with the local health department prior to when we kind of drafted our procedure. One of the things that we are having difficulty with, and we continue to work on this, is that sharing this type of information. So there is a joint memo from the health department and HUD in regarding sharing information, but unfortunately that due to PII and HIPAA, we're not able to launch that share information, but we still need to continue to do our part to notify the health department if we have received information of exposure. So when the owner is notifying of the case by a medical care professional, the owner shall notify the public health department of the name and address of the child within 5 business days. Again, the owner, you need to educate the owner, letting them know that's their responsibility and who they can contact in the public health department. I'd also encourage this also be a collaboration communication. So we encourage owner to CC the housing authority but it's not necessarily required at this point. Owner is also responsible for verification of cases when necessary. So if they receive information from a person who's not a medical care provider that has occurred, they should immediately contact the housing authority. So of course, in your case, you'll contact your agency. So this is a little bit more process for owners, so I'm going to go a little bit slow in detail. An owner, when it has been certified that there's exposure, there needs to be control of the lead-based paint that has to occur. So the owner needs to actually contract out with a certified lead-based paint abatement firm or a certified lead-based paint renovation firm who can work on this. So it can't be something they do themselves or the housing authority. It needs to be a certified company who does it. Depending on the cover unit, if the unit is less than 20, they have 30 days to correct a deficiency. If the unit is more than 20 units that's being impacted, then they would have a longer time, about 60 days. The work, again, should be done throughout the affected areas, and depending on if it's the index area or the common area, these certified firms do know what has to be done. So we don't need to actually educate them on that piece. But once the cleanup has been completed, the owner must notify HUD's field office within 10 business days from passing clearance. Notification to other residents. So as required, the owner must notify all other residents of the evaluation and the control activity. So if there is exposure, they must notify them of the work, when the work was done throughout the process. So that is the owner's responsibility to do so. And then again, ongoing maintenance, they must continue to monitor that cover housing unit to ensure that there isn't any more issues coming down the line, especially with children living in the complexes under 6 years old. As we know in our program, there's always a change in family composition. And that's why we require in our program, they must notify us there is an addition to the family, especially if there is children under 6. So one of the things we do for our agency is we educate the family too and their rights and get a copy of this disclosure form. This is available on the HUD website. It comes in many different forms. Keep in mind, if you are serving people and you're receiving federal funding, you must also comply with the language limited English proficiency requirement. So if you are notifying them of exposures, of their rights and so on, it must be within the language that they are identifying themselves. For our language, we did an analysis and determined for our housing authority in our program, the 2 top written languages is Spanish and Vietnamese. Not saying we're not going to help other people who need other translation in other languages, but for written, we're only required to do Vietnamese and Spanish, but we do have a third-party vendor that provides translation in other types of languages. So we also reach out to HUD who may have some documents in other languages that we can use. So we're going to dive in now to, as an administrator, what is your role and what you need to do. One of the critical things is to have in place before I dive into this, you must have a procedure in place in regarding lead-based paint. That has to do with notification, education, record management, PII, all those. If HUD comes and audits your program, the first thing they're going to ask is there a procedure in place that you have? to educate, to monitor, and so on. So please make sure you have that documented, and you train other staff in that area too. Mm-hmm. So for a grantee, for an administrator, verification of case. So when the notification is coming again from a non-medical health provider, the housing authority or a grantee must immediately verify the information with the public health. Now, as I talked about before, we've been trying to develop a collaboration with the public health department prior to COVID. Of course, they're busy right now. But unfortunately, because of PI and HIPAA, we weren't able to finalize that collaboration. But you are still required to notify them. So please make sure you have on record that you've notified the appropriate parties when you're required to. If EBL has been reported but not verified, the housing authority or grantees or owners shall make 2 attempts to verify the information with the medical health provider or health department. So this would be more of you engaging with the family to see if they have a doctor that they can go to, because there are tests that medical health providers can do, or refer them to over some healthcare system. Okay? And in regards to the 2 attempts, you must have on record that 2 attempts. So please document and log if that's a letter that you're sending out to a family, I don't know, email, phone call. You must document your attempt all through this process in your communication. If the grantee's verification attempts fail, then we must notify the field office, so whoever your representative from the field office is. And then also must attempt his own verification or inform local other entities and so on. So we've talked a little bit about environmental investigation. So it's pretty much a risk assessment. Looking over the units, finding out what the possible risk is, the exposures for families. So that must be conducted within 15 calendar days after the verification of exposure has been given. So that is the responsibility of the grantee and administrator. And there's a chart below that's going to give all these timelines, putting it to a summary. The biggest piece is monitoring the owner's compliance. And this is the biggest piece, is you're engaging and communicating with the owner. Of course, documenting your engagement and your attempt, ensuring that if they continue to delay correction of this deficiency, that we're not going to continue to pay the portion of the rent to them or any kind of funding. So notifying HUD of a confirmed case, notifying the public health department when another healthcare professional notifies the owner of the case, verifying the case when the owners receive information from a person who is not a medically care provider, ensuring they have required the lead hazard control, so passing those, so pretty much the correction has been done, and also ensuring that it's done by a certified firm, ensuring that the residents or other units in the properties are notified of the evaluation and any activities related to the exposure and correction, ensuring the ongoing maintenance of the paint is being monitored. So one of the biggest pieces, if HUD does come and do an audit, or if you're your agency that funds you, is making sure that we do have it all documented or attempt to do so, and that we don't continue to pay out the money in federal assistance if they're not complying with the regulations. In regards to control, we have to ensure that it completes and clear all of the lead paste paint. So making sure that it's been completely resolved, and notifying HUD of the results within 10 business days after clearance. So here's the information pretty much of a notification who you should be notifying. Lead regulation at HUD.gov. is who you should be notifying of these exposures and corrections. Within that email notification, they're requiring you to give the name of your agency. If there's a designated code that's given to you, sometimes if we're federally funded, we are designated as certain codes. We need to give the information of the owners and the address, the date of the test result, so what program, it could be TBRA or COC home program, the unit address, and if the housing is a multi-unit property or development, and the name of the development. If we own it, or if it's just owned by someone else, if the owner has notified public health department, or has been notified by public health department, the date of the notification. So where is the notification coming from? Pretty much they're saying, is it from the public health department, or is it from the medical profession? Things like that. Keep in mind though, when we talk about communication, we need to ensure that the data we collect and the data that is shared is protected and encrypted. So information emailed to HUD should not include the child's name or the blood result due to PII. So that's one of the regulation is if you're federally funded, you need to ensure that your data you're collecting or sharing is encrypted and protected. So this chart just summarizes just the overall who's responsible to do both piece in regards to initial notification of cases. And it could be a collaboration, that's why you see that asterisk in there. So it's actually HCVs, verification if necessary, initial notification of a confirmed case from the public health department, the environmental investigation, the hazard control, when the work has been completed, and notification to residents, including continuing monitoring of the owner's compliance. So I just wanted to summarize it with this chart.
Also, as Tui noted, where you're seeing PHA, that would also apply to grantees.
Yeah, so anytime that I reference in my PowerPoint PHA, I'm just taking it from a point of view that I'm one of the grantees and I'm administering the program. So that would be if you're administering home, COC, and so on, that is your role to do.
Tui, do you want to cover any last points before I go on to my slide?
Sure. So in summary, I know I keep saying this over again, only because I've been through a HUD audit. So I just want to share our experiences is document, document, document. That's the first thing they're going to look for is what you have in place and what you document throughout these cases. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. So as Tui noted, there are quite a number of steps, and we certainly don't expect you to memorize all of that right now, but it will be important to reference a chart like the one that's on this slide and the ones that Tui just went over in the case that a child does have a reported EBLL, because the timeline is pretty tight and there are a lot of moving pieces you're going to want to make sure you have a handle of. So these kind of charts that just lay out the responsibilities and the time frame can be really helpful. And in essence, as Tui noted, the steps are verifying, notifying, conducting that environmental and risk investigation and risk assessment, completing the lead hazard control work, passing the clearance, and then notifying HUD and residents. There are a couple of things I will just note and perhaps reiterate. Since 2017, I do want to call and bring to notice that what qualifies as elevated blood level, it's been cut in half. It now aligns with the CDC standard, so that's at 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. Another thing I want to note is in the past, risk assessments were sufficient, but as per 2017 amendments, now an environmental investigation is required for the index unit. Actually, now I'll use an opportunity to see if anyone perhaps remembers what the difference between an environmental investigation and a risk assessment is. You can either pop that in chat, or again, just feel free to unmute yourself. This can also just present as an opportunity if we can provide some clarity on really what that distinction is between risk assessments and environmental investigations.
I think the risk assessment is when you do the visual, and I think the other one is when there is evidence of the actual lead base.
Thank you. So I think this is a great opportunity just to really clarify 3 different types of assessments. So the visual assessment, which is what I was going over with the pictures, that's what I believe you're referencing. As the name suggests, that's observation, that's visual. A risk assessment is actually, it has a chemical lab component, but what differentiates a risk assessment from an environmental investigation is the environmental investigation takes a risk assessment one step further. It has an interview component. You might be walking down to a playground across the street and sampling soil there to see what factors might be leading to this elevated blood level in the child. So a risk assessment and an environmental investigation are actually quite similar, whereas I would say the visual assessment is the first step, where you're visually observing, okay, there's something, and then paint stabilization needs to happen. The risk assessment and the environmental investigation are after those determinations. It's just environmental investigation takes it one step further. It has those interviews. The risk assessment is more just the chemical testing. And so I also want to make clear, you're doing an environmental investigation for the index unit, and then you're doing a risk assessment for all of those other covered units that might have children under the age of 6, even if they don't have elevated blood level reports. So you're doing both. One, it's a more intense version for the index unit where the actual report has been identified, and then a risk assessment for all the other covered ones. Does that make it a little clearer? Thank you so much for sharing, though. I think it's a great moment to really nail down what the distinctions are of these terms. Another thing I want to note is that certified lead-based paint inspectors are trained to identify lead-based paint on surfaces, but they're not qualified to conduct risk assessments. So you want to make sure you have a certified risk assessor, and an environmental investigation can be conducted by the health department that would meet the standards. And environmental investigations can last for, or findings can last for a year, so those should be kept on record. Finally, I want to note that if a child has moved by the time the designated party receives notification, the elevated blood level response requirements still apply to the unit of any other household that's receiving the TBRA and is living in that unit or is planning to live there, even if the next family that's moving in doesn't have a child, the steps, these requirements for EBLL response are still going to be in place. And if you need to relocate tenants while the work is being carried out, you'll want to think through if the owners can provide a unit and who will be paying for relocation. The lead safe housing rule isn't specific about who's responsible for this, so it will need to be worked out. And temporary relocation is necessary if a resident doesn't have access to a kitchen and bathroom during non-work hours. I also want to cover or just circle back to managing privacy of information, which Tui covered. So information emailed and shared with HUD should not include the child's name or blood result unless done in a secure manner in an encrypted email if absolutely necessary. So this information should be kept private, again, unless absolutely necessary that you have to disclose it. And like, for example, in a conversation with the public health department, this is considered personally identifiable information. It must be maintained in accordance with the grantee's policy for private medical information. And the public health department is a great resource for tips and best practices on managing privacy of information. And if you're reaching out to HUD during that first step of elevated blood level response, and you're requesting HUD's assistance in verifying a report, at that point, the conversation really just can be limited to, I have an address where we provide assistance that received an elevated blood level report, we need to move forward. There doesn't need to be much more than that. And the slide, I'm just going to quickly go back to this one, that TUI provided really lists what should be included in the email. So just make sure you're not including the child's name or the blood result, but you are including the following. Also want to touch on, in terms of ongoing support, the Office of Supportive Housing will report an updated list of units that are receiving tenant-based rental assistance to the Public Health Department on at least a quarterly basis. Here, only the addresses need to be shared, and they should request, likewise, that the Public Health Department inform them if they identify an elevated blood level child in any of these addresses. You want to attempt to, OSH will attempt to obtain names and addresses of children under the age of 6 with the identified EBLL on at least a quarterly basis, and then match information from both lists and notify subrecipients. The CDC has noted a decline by almost 40% in blood level testing in young children following the onset of COVID-19. And jurisdictions are also additionally having trouble locating lead-poisoned children as many families are shifting residences. And as I mentioned at the start of this training, young children are being confined in these spaces more than ever before with shelter-in-place orders. So exposure to potential hazards has been heightened. And keeping that in mind, I'm now going to go over some short-term actions that you can help share with families in housing, especially that's built prior to 1978, to prevent exposure to lead. So some of these interim steps are washing children's hands and toys regularly to help remove lead dust, creating safe play areas for children that are in the center of the room, away from those flaking paint surfaces, potentially placing furniture or other barriers in front of windows that have flaking paint, and likewise moving cribs away from walls with deteriorated paint surfaces. Some other steps are, if there's flaking lead paint, you want to wet, clean indoor floors, windowsills, porches, and decks weekly. You want to make sure families are not scraping or sanding painted surfaces. When vacuuming, it's really important that you do not use a regular vacuum because that can just further distribute and spread lead-based paint dust particles. So you want to make sure when vacuuming, you're using a high efficiency particulate air filter. Placing a doormat at entrances and taking shoes off at the door can also prevent bringing in lead-based paint dust. And then regularly changing air conditioning and heating unit filters has also been an identified interim step. These recommendations were developed by North Carolina's Health Homes Office, and we've hyperlinked it both at the bottom and the title of the slide deck. So they have a bunch of resources that can be shared with families as interim steps for managing lead-based paint hazards. I now want to quickly cover an additional resource, which is the Office of Supportive Housing's lead-based paint policy. This is listed on the COC website. I'm going to briefly stop screen sharing so I can share another screen. So I hope this is large enough for people to read. So this is OSHA's lead-based paint policy, and really in building this out, the policy tries to be as robust and comprehensive as possible. There are various embedded links, so it's kind of a one-stop shop in terms of policies. So it really lays out the compliance steps that we've covered through this training. At the top, you will see subrecipients can go or link to HUD's website to kind of talk you through using their lead rule compliance advisor tool to first determine whether lead-based paint requirements are triggered. Then the policy links to the exact disclosure form that needs to be kept on file, which, as I mentioned, it's really important that you make sure you have the correct disclosure form on file. Failure to comply can result in a hefty fine. There's the copy of the pamphlet that should also be kept on file. Really clearly indicates that these disclosure requirements are required for all units built prior to 1978 and for units that additionally house children under the age of 6. Then lays out the steps with each designated party who's responsible for these steps. Here we see, again, a hyperlink to the online visual assessment training, which I gave a brief preview of. When subrecipients do conduct a visual assessment training, we also have a little attachment here, which you would keep on file, just certifying that you've conducted a visual assessment, you have the date, you have the address, you have your findings. So this is an example of what that would be. So here we're seeing, in the case of elevated blood lead levels, the additional steps that need to be made. So with this policy, we really encourage agencies to, after this training, reference back this policy, make sure your agency has robust written policies and procedures in place, adapt this as you see fit. I'm going to go back to sharing our PowerPoint quick. So, 1 second. Now, I know we've covered quite a few things today, and so if there are only a select number of things you take away from this presentation, I really want you to remember, 1, all households built prior to 1978, whether a child under the age of 6 is expected to live there or not, they need to be provided those disclosure forms in the pamphlets, again, linked in OSHA's policy for quick reference, but also at the end of the slide deck. If there's a child under 6 that is expected to live in a pre-1978 unit, the visual assessment needs to be conducted. And then that de minimis thresholds are determining the how, but all deteriorated paint must be repaired. So those are my key takeaways. I know Tui's was document, document, document. So Tui, do you want to jump in with some other key takeaways before we move on?
Sure. So for a compliance point of view, of course, I talked about documentation, but I also want to make sure that it's education too. So while this is a very complex process that we have to do, is to educate our owners to make sure that our families are safe in their environment. So it's educating, documenting, and just monitoring the whole lead-based paint program within our project that we administer.
So we are almost at the end of the slide deck, and then we will address some of the additional questions I've seen come in. I just want to cover some resources that I said we have linked. So the first one, it comes from Georgia's Department of Community Affairs. It has an ESG focus, but is a really great resource to understand lead-based paint requirements and guidance. So especially for ESG grantees, this would be a great resource. The second one, again, comes from North Carolina's Healthy Homes. This will have those pamphlets and tips and interim steps to share with families in the case of, what are immediate steps that families can take to better protect children at home right now. Then we have HUD's Lead Safe Housing Rule Amendment Training, which is close to 2 hours, a really comprehensive training. So if there are more details you want to dig into, that's another great resource. There is the Office of Lead Hazard Control in Healthy Homes lead disclosure form and pamphlet. So once again, I said and I really want to emphasize, it's really important to make sure you have the right form, because there are various forms that look kind of similar floating around, but we really want to make sure we're connecting you to the right form and pamphlet. So it's there and it's in a couple other places. We've also linked to HUD's visual assessment training, which again is a free training we encourage everyone to take, where you can take it for 20 minutes and then you can get certified to conduct visual assessments. And then finally, we have OSHA's lead-based paint policy, which we again really encourage all agency staff to take a look at. Tui, do you want to cover some of the resources that you've shared?
Sure. So there are some pamphlets that's available already created by HUD that we can share with our family and share with our owners. So I wanted to just give you a screenshot of it, but also a link to it. I know at this point it's not in many different languages, but I know HUD is still working on translating some of this information. So it reduces, you know, our attempt to recreate everything again. So I wanted to share that. In addition, in the next slide, I have many links to many more resources. One of the things that HUD will do if they do audit you is making sure that you have documentation that staff is trained. So make sure you have that on place, you know, like a training acknowledgement form and so on. But I wanted to highlight some of the content that I got from my PowerPoint and where I received the information. There's also some overlap. So there's one that I actually really like called the Lead Rule Compliance Advisor. So it kind of takes you through quick little PowerPoint of being compliant. There's also a lot of videos and expertise who's in that field to help you understand how to do some of these instructions and so on. And then there's another more pamphlets and flyers that was developed by HUD. So I want to share it with you about working with the local health department and how to do that, and also some educational ones for blood levels in children. So I want to give that copy for everyone.
Great, thank you so much. So now we're at the end of our presentation part. And before I take questions, just want to note that, you know, we recognize that lead-based paint is not an area agencies might feel fully comfortable with or feel like they have enough experience or expertise with. And we're certainly not expecting you to walk away from this training now feeling like you're an expert. But we do hope that this training has, one, emphasized the importance of detecting lead-based paint hazards early on. And as I mentioned, this has been an area of focus during HUD monitoring, and we expect it will continue to be an area of focus. And while our community has not had, you know, record numbers of lead-based paint cases, it is something we should all be mindful of, especially with communities that have older housing stock. And the expectation is that after this training, agency staff feel empowered and comfortable just ensuring that your agency has robust written policies and procedures in place. So we really encourage you to use OSHA's lead-based paint policy as a reference, adapt it as you see fit. We encourage you to reach out to OSH or to home base if you have any questions. And if we don't have immediate answers, we're certainly happy to help connect you with additional resources. But the expectation is that agencies really do need to have these robust written policies in place. So we hope we have helped give you some resources to help think that through, but really encourage you to reach out to us if you have further questions. And I think now with kind of the last 10 minutes, we can either go over some of the slides that might have seemed a little confusing, or just answer questions that have come in the chat, or you can also feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions as well. So I'm seeing, can the blood levels also include adults or children older than the age of 6? So the reason why we really emphasize children under the age of 6 is, as I've mentioned when kind of talking about the impacts of lead-based paint, it certainly can impact people who have extended exposure, as I said, people who work around lead for extended periods of time, as well as individuals who have children, because it can leach into the fetus. But the reason why we focus on children under the age of 6 is for a few biological reasons, just because that ratio of blood level to the size of a body is one reason. So that's the focus where, and also just unique developmental factors for as a child's growing. It's a particular concern for children under the age of 6. So it manifests and looks a little different with older adults, and there's certainly resources that the CDC can provide around that. But the Let's Safe Housing Rule is very focused on children under the age of 6 because they are the most vulnerable. Does that, Colin, you can respond either through chat or come off mute. Does that help with that answer or question?
Can I add something, Nicole, to that, if
Absolutely.
you don't mind? So definitely, I echo what Nicole is saying. The regulation is more focused in that age limit because of the vulnerability and because of the nature. You know, I mean, we have children, you know, crawling, playing around in the units, touching things and so on, putting things in their mouth and so on, or hopefully not eating it and so on like that. So that's why HUD and the health department is focusing more in that age limit because of the vulnerability, not only because of exposure, but also because of being exposed pretty much is more high. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And as we did mention, there are a few sources of lead exposure, but really for children, the most common is that lead-based paint dust. And we're again focusing on children under the age of 6, as Tui said, they're more susceptible to, you know, kind of be crawling around, having it on their hands, and then perhaps putting their hands in their mouths and swallowing that and digesting it. So there's that concern. And then Tui, I don't know if you're seeing the question about apartments or houses. To my knowledge, the community hasn't, as I said, hasn't had a record number of lead-based paint cases at the moment. And please feel free to jump in if you have additional context here. But it is still something that we need to be incredibly mindful of in terms of just having procedures in place in the instance that an elevated blood lead level report is identified, that we know how to respond appropriately. Mm-hmm. But to my knowledge, there haven't been high levels of reports in the community thus far.
So from my knowledge, there's no centralized location that captures this information. So the question I'm seeing is how many apartments in Santa Clara has a high level of lead, and the centralized department that collects this is the health department. So they'll be having this information. So it's more about your inventory in your community, the age of your inventory in your community, that would actually make you a higher risk of possible exposure. I hope that answers your question. And by the way, I suspect since we are sharing this information with HUD, I think they're going to start collecting it and possibly sharing the results overall. Because before, prior to this, it wasn't information that we were required to share with HUD's office.
Some other questions that I saw earlier, and I tried to respond to in the chat, but maybe I can just call out in case it was lost in the chat. Let me just look back. One, yes, the de minimis calculations that I went over, those are going to be provided in the materials we send out in the slide deck for you to reference. We're also sending out the recording, it'll be posted to the CSC website, so you're going to have all of these materials. With housing built prior to 1978, yes, the assumption is because lead-based paint was banned for commercial sale and residential use at that time, that's why the focus isn't on units post 1978. In some instances, would lead-based paint still be found in those units? Yes, but for the most part, because it was banned, that's why that's the year cut off. Can you contact the health department to obtain information of apartments?
So the question is there a possibility the health department can share that information? We've been able to get some information. I'm not showing the code on your side if you'd be able to get some of the overall numbers of exposures.
We don't have those numbers, but I've kind of gone back to just the slide that talks about ongoing responsibility. So the expectation is that it goes both ways, where you're reporting an updated list of units that are receiving assistance, and public health department is on a quarterly basis, matching information and providing names so that that step can be taken. But at the moment, I don't know if I personally don't have that information. And I think there have been a few delays with the public health department just because of limited capacity, but I don't have much to add on that beyond what TUI provided.
I think, Nicole, that was all the questions I see on chat.
Likewise.
There are two more information, if you don't mind, I share with the group. We briefly went over documentation and record keeping. For the requirements of lead-based paint, it is required to at least keep it for at least 3 years after the notification of exposure. So keep that in mind. But there may be other local or state requirements, but all I know is for the federal level is at least 3 years after. And then also you may come across some owners who's like, I don't know who to help me get a certified firm to help clean up. In the HUD website, they do have lists of firms who've been certified. So I can send that link to Nicole and she can share it with the group so you can help your owners do that process.
Colleen, I believe so long as your form is stating that, the focus is on children under 6. So I don't know that that would necessarily require that you go and change your form. So even as is, that's one step additional, but you really want to make sure you're covering children under this age of 6, but it can include children 6 or under. Please feel free to either come off mute if you have a question or pop it in the chat. But if not, we really appreciate your time today and attending and recognizing that this is something we all really need to be mindful of. And I hope this kind of demystified some of the steps, made it a little clearer. Again, really want to encourage you to reach out to us, to Osh. We're resources here to help you. And if I could also just quickly plug a feedback form link. We ask for feedback after all of our trainings, and we really cannot stress this enough. We really do look through all of the responses and are very mindful in terms of how we adapt our trainings in the future, because we really want our trainings to be the best and most useful for you. So if you could just take 2 minutes to fill that out, we'd be super appreciative, and it just helps us plan for trainings in the future. But other than that, maybe I can give you a minute back of your day, and thank you so much for joining us.